Everything seemed perfect from the outside: wealth, beauty, and a life of luxury most would envy. But behind the immaculate facade, cracks had already started to form. And tonight, as the sun sets over our pristine backyard, those cracks are about to shatter wide open. Because sometimes, what you don't see is far more dangerous than what's right in front of you. Enjoy story. I sat in my study, staring out at the perfectly manicured lawn stretching out beyond the glass doors. The setting sun cast a warm glow over the pool, making everything look like something out of a luxury lifestyle magazine. The kind of life people dream of. Designer clothes in the closet, a house most would kill for, and vacations in places most can only imagine. But as I swirled the whiskey in my hand, the only thing I felt was the strange emptiness that had been creeping in for years. Our life, this perfect, polished existence, had become just that, polished. Nothing beneath the surface, but hollow echoes. Sophia came into the room, her heels clicking softly against the hardwood floor. She looked stunning, of course, wearing a flowing dress that probably cost more than some people's rent. She glanced at me, her eyes briefly meeting mine before drifting to the glass in my hand. "Another drink tonight?" she asked, her voice light but with that edge I was all too familiar with. I shrugged, tipping the glass slightly toward her. "Why not? Might as well enjoy something real." She didn't respond, just walked over to the window, looking out at the same perfect view I'd been lost in minutes earlier. I watched her for a moment, her silhouette framed against the last of the day's light. She sighed softly, almost too soft to notice, but I caught it. The weariness. "Everything okay?" I asked, not really expecting an answer. We both knew the routine by now. "Of course," she replied, but the way her voice faltered, just for a second, told me everything. She wasn't okay. Neither of us were. She stood there a little longer, staring out at the backyard as if she could find something out there that would make all this feel less empty. But there was nothing left to find. As she turned to leave the room, she hesitated. "You're coming to dinner tomorrow, right? With the Hensons?" I forced a smile. "Wouldn't miss it." She gave a small nod and walked out, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the slowly darkening sky. Sophia had always been magnetic. She could walk into a room and everyone's attention would snap to her like she was the only one there. And she knew it. For years, I'd been proud of that, proud to have the woman everyone else admired. But now, when I looked at her, I couldn't help but feel like I was seeing cracks beneath that perfect surface. Lately, Sophia had been on this obsessive journey to stay flawless, to hold on to her youth and beauty like it was slipping through her fingers. Every week, it seemed like she was going in for some new procedure, something to smooth, lift, tighten. Facials, Botox, laser treatments. I could barely keep track of what was real anymore. She spent more time with dermatologists than she did with me. I remember one evening, she was sitting at her vanity, applying yet another serum to her face. It was like watching an artist at work, only this wasn't art, it was desperation. Her fingers moved quickly, tapping and smoothing as she stared at herself in the mirror, her face bathed in the soft glow of vanity lights. "You're perfect, you know," I said from the doorway. I tried to sound casual, but I could hear the edge in my voice. She didn't even look up. "No one stays perfect, Mark. That's the problem." Her voice was cool, detached. Like we weren't even talking about her. I stepped closer, leaning against the dresser. "You don't have to keep doing this. You're beautiful just the way you are." This time she met my gaze, and for a split second I saw it: fear. Not the usual anxiety about aging, but something deeper, darker. She gave me a smile, but it was thin, almost like a mask she was forcing herself to wear. "You don't get it," she said quietly, turning back to her reflection. "You never have." That was new, the bitterness in her voice. I was used to her being distant, but this was something else. I watched her for a moment longer before heading downstairs. Something about that conversation stayed with me, like a splinter under my skin. The next morning, I found her sitting by the pool, scrolling through her phone. She was always glued to that thing lately, more than usual. "I'm heading out. Damien's coming over later for a session, she said without looking up. Damien, her masseur, or as she called him, her therapist. He was around more than I was these days. Again? I asked, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. You had a session 2 days ago? Sophia shrugged, her eyes still on the screen. It helped me unwind. Don't worry, I'll be fine. I didn't push it, but something about her answer didn't sit right. I watched her lounging there, picture perfect in the morning sun. But all I could think about was how distant she'd become. Like she was slipping away from me, piece by piece, and I couldn't figure out why. It wasn't just the cosmetic stuff. It was more than that. It was the way she seemed to be fading into a world I wasn't part of anymore. A world of perfect images of endless procedures, and of this strange bond she had with Damien and her friend Emily. They were always around. And Sophia? She was pulling further and further into their orbit. I felt it in my gut, that something was happening, something I wasn't seeing yet. But I could sense it. And whatever it wasn't good. That IT was 4 years ago, when we decided to have a baby. At the time, it seemed like the natural next step, a way to add real meaning to our lives beyond the luxury and the image we projected. I remember how excited we were, especially Sophia. She'd talk about how a child would change everything for us, give us purpose. She spent hours planning the nursery, browsing online for designer cribs and baby clothes that were more expensive than anything I'd ever worn. When she found out she was pregnant, it was like we finally had something real, something deeper than all the superficial nonsense we surrounded ourselves with. For the first time in years, I saw a genuine glow in her, a happiness that had nothing to do with Botox or material things. It was like she had found herself again, the old Sophia I'd fallen in love with. But as life so often does, it had other plans. Sophia miscarried a few months into the pregnancy. One night everything was fine, and the next it wasn't. I came home from work late as usual. I remember the quiet, how still the house felt. I found her in the bathroom, sitting on the cold tile floor, her eyes red and swollen, her body trembling. "Mark," she whispered when she saw me. Her voice was fragile, like it might break apart at any moment. "I lost the baby." I stood there, frozen, the words not quite sinking in. "What? How?" Her face crumpled, and she buried it in her hands, sobbing. I rushed to her, holding her as tightly as I could, but there was nothing I could say, nothing that would make it better. I remember thinking I could fix this somehow, like it was just another problem to solve. But as I held her, feeling her body shake with grief, I realized there was no fixing this. Not for either of us. After that, things changed. Sophia retreated into herself, pulling away from me, from everything. She was no longer the vibrant, social woman I had known. Instead, she spent her days in bed, staring at the ceiling, barely eating, barely speaking. And when she did speak, it was only to blame herself. If I had done things differently, if I had taken better care of myself, she'd say, over and over, as if repeating it would somehow make sense of the pain. I tried to be there for her, but I felt myself starting to pull away too. I didn't know how to deal with her grief, or my own, for that matter. The miscarriage wasn't just the loss of our child. It was the loss of everything I thought we could be, everything I thought we were supposed to be. And slowly, that loss became a wedge between us. Sophia's obsession with her appearance intensified. Her face became more and more like a mask, sculpted and preserved to hide the pain she was refusing to confront. The procedures became more frequent, more drastic. She stopped talking about the baby, stopped talking to me really. Instead, she focused on fixing herself in ways I knew had nothing to do with her body and everything to do with her broken heart. There were moments when I'd watch her from across the room, feeling more like a stranger than her husband. I'd think about that night, about the child we lost, and wonder if there was something more I could have done to stop her from slipping away. But I didn't know how to reach her anymore. I didn't know how to pull her back from the edge she was standing on after the miscarriage. Sophia changed, but she didn't fall apart, not in the way people expected. She built a new kind of strength, almost like armor. And that armor came with two new people, Emily and Damien. Emily had always been a part of our lives, Sophia's longtime friend, the one who knew every detail of our relationship, every flaw. But after the miscarriage, Emily became something more than a friend. She was there constantly, at the house, in the pool, at dinners. At first I welcomed it. Sophia needed someone. She needed support, and God knows I wasn't equipped to handle what she was going through. But then Damien came into the picture. Damien, the masseur. Young, attractive, and charming in that effortless way some people have. He wasn't just another spa worker. He quickly became a fixture at our home. At first, it made sense. Sophia had been dealing with so much stress, and Damien's so-called therapeutic massages were supposed to help her relax. But soon the sessions became more frequent. Late afternoons turned into late nights. And more than once, I found myself coming home to find him leaving, sweat still glistening on his neck, as if he'd just finished a workout rather than a professional session. "You should really let Damien work on you sometime," Sophia said one evening, her tone light but her eyes locked on me, almost daring me to protest. "I'm good," I replied, forcing a smile. Something about the idea of him touching me made my skin crawl. Damien wasn't just her therapist anymore. He was something else, something I didn't understand yet. The way Sophia talked about him, how much she trusted him, how much he understood her, it was unsettling. I started noticing how she'd light up when he was around, a brightness in her eyes I hadn't seen in a long time. Then there was Emily. At first, I didn't mind her presence. It was comforting to know someone close was keeping an eye on Sophia. But soon, she and Damien were almost inseparable, along with Sophia. It was the three of them, always the three of them. One evening, I came home earlier than expected. The house was quiet. I walked through the rooms, calling for Sophia, but there was no answer. I headed toward the backyard, hearing faint splashes coming from the pool. That's when I saw them, Sophia, Emily, and Damien, lounging by the pool, drinks in hand, laughing together like they were in on some private joke. The scene felt off, wrong, and not because of what they were doing. It was the closeness, the way they leaned into each other, touched each other, their private little world that I was clearly excluded from. For a brief second, I couldn't help but imagine how satisfying it would be if something interrupted their perfect little bubble. Maybe the drinks would spill, maybe they'd trip and fall into the pool, something, anything to break up this strange bond one couldn't penetrate. And then, as if the universe was listening to my silent wish, a bird swooped down out of nowhere. Its timing was impeccable, almost too perfect. With a swift flap of its wings, it flew right over Damien's head and splattered a fresh streak of bird poop all over his perfectly tanned shoulder. Damien froze, his hand still mid-gesture, while Sophia and Emily burst into hysterical laughter. Their giggles filled the air, and for once, it felt like I wasn't the only one on the outside of the joke. Damien grimaced, wiping the mess off with a towel, muttering curses under his breath. I leaned against the doorway, struggling to hide the smirk creeping across my face. Sometimes, karma worked quicker than expected. Damien glanced up, catching me watching from the patio door. His eyes narrowed for a split second before his practiced, charming smile returned. He wiped his shoulder clean, tossing the towel onto a nearby chair like the whole thing was beneath him. Sophia and Emily were still giggling, oblivious to the tension, as if nothing could crack the bubble they'd created. "Mark, come join us," Emily called out, waving me over like we were old friends. She was grinning, her eyes sparkling from either the wine or the private joke I clearly wasn't a part of. I forced a smile and took a step outside, the cool evening air brushing against my skin. I couldn't let them see what was really going on in my head, couldn't let them know that I was no longer just an observer. "Maybe next time," I said, nodding at their drinks. "I think I've had enough fun for today." Sophia barely glanced my way, too busy laughing as Damien made some dry remark about his luck. That look, the one she used to save just for me, was gone, replaced by a carefree smile that felt foreign, like I was staring at a version of her I didn't know anymore. I turned and headed back inside, leaving them to their little world by the pool. But as I stepped back into the house, the smirk I'd been holding onto disappeared. The bird strike had been amusing, sure, but it didn't change the fact that something was deeply wrong. I couldn't shake the feeling that this was more than just a friendship between them. Whatever they had going on, I was certain of one thing. I wasn't part of it. And that terrified me. One evening, I walked into the house after a long, late meeting, my mind still buzzing from the endless negotiations. I loosened my tie, letting out a tired breath, expecting the usual silence of the house. But tonight was different. Soft music played, low and intimate, drifting from the pool area. The lights in the living room were dimmed, and I could hear the faint murmur of voices outside, mixed with the occasional burst of quiet laughter. Something pulled me toward the sound, an instinct I couldn't ignore. I stepped toward the sliding glass doors, pausing just before I could be seen. And that's when I saw them. Sophia, Emily, Damien. They were by the pool, their bodies close, almost intertwined. Sophia sat on Damien's lap, her head leaning against his chest as his hands roamed her back in a way that was anything but innocent. Emily sat beside them, her legs draped lazily in the water, watching with a satisfied smile. The three of them were wrapped in their own private world, so comfortable, so intimate. My chest tightened. I stood frozen, gripping the edge of the doorframe. They hadn't noticed me. I could hear their whispers, soft but clear enough to catch pieces of their conversation. "Damien, we'll have it all soon enough," Emily purred, swirling her drink in her hand. "Once this is over, Mark will be out of the picture. It'll be perfect." Sophia shifted, her laugh light but cold. "He's so blind. He doesn't see anything coming." My heart pounded in my chest, the truth slamming into me like a wrecking ball. This wasn't just an affair. This was a plot, a conspiracy. They were planning something much bigger than just sneaking around behind my back. I stepped back, moving deeper into the shadows, careful not to make a sound. They still hadn't noticed me, too wrapped up in each other. I couldn't listen anymore. I turned and slipped back inside, my mind racing. The next morning, my mind still reeled from what I had seen. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the way they had laughed about it, so casual, so careless. I spent the day pretending everything was normal, even managing a conversation with Sophia over breakfast, as if the night before hadn't happened. But I knew I needed answers, more than just what I had overheard. While Sophia was out with Emily that afternoon, I went through her things. I started with her phone, scrolling through messages, then moved on to her emails. And that's where I found it. Buried in her inbox was a series of emails between her and Emily, their true intentions laid out in stark, cruel detail. The miscarriage, our miscarriage, wasn't just a tragedy. It was a tool they were planning to use against me. Emily and Damien, possibly manipulated by Sophia or in cahoots with her, had planned everything. They were going to frame me. The emails painted a picture of a husband who was distant, cold, emotionally neglectful. They were going to spin the story that I was the reason Sophia had lost the baby, that my lack of care, my absence, had caused her grief and trauma, leading to the miscarriage. They were carefully constructing a version of events where I was the villain, and they were going to use that narrative to ruin me. It wasn't just about Sophia cheating. This was about money, my fortune, the business I had built, the assets I had carefully managed for years. They were planning to take everything from me. The miscarriage had been the beginning of their plot, a way to paint me as the neglectful, emotionally abusive husband. And when the time was right, they'd strike, destroying my reputation and leveraging the story to take me for everything I had. I stood there, staring at the screen, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place with terrifying clarity. Sophia's breakdown wasn't a breakdown at all. It was part of the plan, a way to make me believe she was fragile, vulnerable. I had played right into their hands, believing I needed to pull back, to give her space. But all that space I had given her, it had only made it easier for them to trap me. I slammed the laptop shut, my pulse hammering in my ears. I could feel the anger rising, the rage burning deep in my gut. They thought they could do this to me. They thought I wouldn't figure it out, that I was blind to what they were planning. They were wrong. I wasn't just going to sit back and let this happen. They wanted to ruin me? I'd make sure they regretted ever trying. They thought they had me cornered. They thought I would sit by quietly, spiraling into the role of the broken husband they were painting me to be. But the moment I uncovered their plan, something inside me shifted. It was like a switch had been flipped. The sadness, the shock, all of it melted away, leaving only a chilling clarity. I wasn't going to let them destroy me. Instead of confronting Sophia, I played along. I smiled when she smiled, kissed her on the cheek when she left the house for her sessions with Damien, all the while planning what came next. I knew I couldn't act impulsively. They were expecting me to fall apart, to react emotionally, and that's exactly what I couldn't afford to do. No, I needed to be smarter than that. I started watching Damien more closely, learning his routines. He was a creature of habit, predictable in his movements. Every Tuesday, he visited a private gym not far from his apartment, then headed straight to the pool where he and Sophia had their sessions. He always arrived early, spending time alone by the water before Sophia joined him. It was the perfect opportunity. I couldn't just take him down physically. That would be too obvious, too direct. I needed him to fall apart mentally, emotionally, so that when he finally broke, it would look like nothing more than a tragic accident. I began planting the seeds slowly. Anonymous messages delivered to his door. Small, unnerving signs that made him question his own mind. The first note was simple. You don't deserve her. It was a small thing, something he could brush off. But I knew it would linger, gnaw at the back of his mind. The next week, I escalated. I left a photograph of him and Sophia, an image I'd taken from a distance, showing them together at the pool. On the back of the photo, I scrawled, "She'll ruin you too." I could see the paranoia building in him. When we crossed paths at the house, his usual confident smile was strained. He looked over his shoulder more often, and his casual glances at Sophia had turned sharp, calculating, like he was trying to read between the lines of her words. The final stage of the plan came on a Tuesday. I watched from a distance as Damien arrived at the gym, just like always. I had hacked into his phone the night before, leaving one last message that he wouldn't be able to ignore. "She's playing you. Ask her what really happened to the baby." When he left the gym, I followed, careful to stay out of sight. He was unraveling, his mind spiraling out of control. He barely noticed as I slipped into his apartment just moments after he did, using the key I'd copied weeks ago. Inside, I confronted him, my voice calm, steady, as I laid out everything. How Sophia and Emily had been using him, how they were planning to pin everything on him when their scheme finally fell apart. I watched as the panic took over, as the cracks I had been slowly chiseling into his mind split wide open. "You can't do this to me," he muttered, his voice shaking. I was helping her." "She doesn't care about you, Damien," I said, leaning in close. "She never did. You were just a pawn." His eyes widened as the weight of my words sank in, and I could see him start to crumble. And then, like clockwork, it happened. He snapped. In his frantic state, he lunged at me, desperate, wild, but I was ready. With one swift movement, I sidestepped, sending him crashing into the corner of the counter. The crack of his skull against the marble was deafening. He collapsed onto the floor, blood pooling around his head. I stood over him, watching as the life drained from his eyes. But not completely. He wasn't dead. Not yet. Just incapacitated, his body limp, his mind shattered. He would never speak again. Never tell anyone what had happened. An accident, they would say. A tragic fall. Damien would be written off, forgotten. And I ensured that no one would ever know the truth. With Damien out of the way, I turned my attention to Sophia and Emily. Their time was coming, and I knew exactly how to end it. I didn't need to manipulate them like I had with Damien. They had already done most of the work for me. spiraling deeper into their own arrogance, believing they were untouchable. It was almost poetic how it would end for them, by the very pool where they had planned my downfall, where they had paraded their betrayal so brazenly. The night of the plan, I suggested we have dinner by the pool. Sophia, completely oblivious, agreed easily. I had everything laid out perfectly, candles, wine, the whole setup to make it look like the perfect romantic evening. Emily joined us, as she always did, and the two of them drank and laughed like nothing had changed. But I had made sure everything was in place. As the evening wore on, I subtly led them to the edge of the pool, where the water shimmered under the dim lights. They were tipsy, relaxed, and completely unaware of what was coming next. "I'm going to grab another bottle of wine," I said, stepping away briefly, leaving them standing at the water's edge, giggling like schoolgirls. I returned moments later, the scene exactly how I had envisioned it. With one swift movement, I knocked Emily into the pool. Her laughter turned to a scream as she splashed into the water. Sophia rushed to help her, but I was quicker. I grabbed Sophia's arm, yanking her into the pool alongside Emily. Panic washed over their faces as they struggled to stay afloat, but I was prepared. I had timed everything perfectly. The way they'd slip under the water, the way their bodies would thrash before finally going still. It was poetic justice, drowning in the very place where their betrayal had bloomed, their twisted relationship ending as silently as it had begun. As the last bubbles of their struggle broke the surface, I stood over the pool, watching as the water stilled, the reflections of their lifeless bodies glistening beneath the surface. An accident, I would say, a tragic accident by the pool. No one would suspect a thing. The aftermath was almost too easy. When the police arrived, I played the part of the devastated husband perfectly. Tears in my eyes, voice shaking, describing how we had been drinking by the pool, how I had left for just a few moments to grab another bottle of wine, how I came back to find them both in the water, lifeless. A tragic accident. No one questioned me. Why would they? After all, I had set the scene perfectly. The alcohol, the slippery tiles, the absence of any sign of struggle. It was all so carefully staged. The police offered their condolences. The neighbors whispered about how terrible it was, how tragic for one man to lose so much. They spoke of how strong I must be, how well I was handling everything. If they only knew. I covered my tracks so well even I almost believed it. Almost. No one would ever know what really happened that night. There were no witnesses, no loose ends. Damien's accident had been the perfect prelude. Now, with Sophia and Emily gone, there was no one left to accuse me. No one left to challenge my version of events. It wasn't long before Sophia's insurance payout came through. A hefty sum, enough to retire on, to live comfortably for the rest of my life. A final, cold reward for surviving their betrayal. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sitting in the living room of the house, our lavish home, I poured myself a glass of expensive wine, one of the bottles Sophia had bought for a special occasion, the same kind we had been drinking by the pool that night. I leaned back in the chair, staring out at the pool where it all ended. The water was calm, still reflecting the soft glow of the lights surrounding it. If you didn't know the truth, you'd think it was just another peaceful night in paradise. But I knew. As I sipped the wine, I reflected on the life we had built, the luxury, the wealth, the appearances we maintained so carefully. For years, it had seemed perfect from the outside at least. But beneath all that, there was rot. It had always been there, festering just below the surface. The lies, the deceit, the betrayal. Sophia had been masking her true self for so long, I don't think she even knew who she was anymore. And me? Maybe I had been doing the same. Maybe I had been pretending too, living in denial about who we had become, what we had allowed ourselves to turn into. Now it was all gone. The betrayal had been washed away, drowned in that pool. I had taken back control, ensured that no one could destroy what was mine. But as I sat there, staring into the water, a question lingered in the back of my mind, a quiet, nagging voice that refused to be silenced. I got what I wanted. The payout. My freedom. No more lies, no more games. But at what cost? I took another slow sip of the wine, letting it burn its way down, cold and empty. The house was quiet now, eerily so. There was no laughter, no voices echoing through the halls. No Sophia. No Emily. No Damien. Just me. I stared at the pool, watching the light ripple across the surface. And for the first time, I didn't feel satisfaction. There was no triumph in this victory. Only silence. And the unsettling truth that maybe, just maybe, I had lost something far more important than they had ever taken from me. As I finished the wine, I set the glass down beside me and leaned back, my eyes still locked on the pool. Everything was calm, peaceful. I had covered my tracks. I had walked away free. But the reflection of the water, that still, dark pool, held the truth that no one would ever see.